Don Juan helped me to sit up, and then I saw Don Genaro walking towards us with a nonchalant air. He smiled coyly and asked me if I had liked his flying. I attempted to say something, but I was speechless. Don Genaro exchanged a strange look with Don Juan and adopted a squat position again. He leaned over and whispered something in my left ear. I heard him say, "Why don't you come and fly with me?" He repeated it 5 or 6 times. Don Juan came towards me and whispered in my right ear, "Don't talk, just follow Genaro." Don Genaro made me squat and whispered to me again. I heard him with crystal clear precision. He repeated the statement perhaps 10 times. He said, "Trust the Nahual. The Nahual will take you." Then Don Juan whispered in my right ear another statement. He said, "Change your feelings." I could hear both of them talking to me at once, but I could also hear them individually. Every one of Don Genaro's statements had to do with the general context of gliding through the air. The statements that he repeated dozens of times seemed to be those that became engraved in my memory. Don Juan's words, on the other hand, had to do with specific commands, which he repeated countless times. The effect of that dual whispering was most extraordinary. It was as if the sound of their individual words were splitting me in half. Finally, the abyss between my 2 ears was so wide that I lost all sense of unity. There was something that was undoubtedly me, but it was not solid. It was rather like a glowing fog, a dark yellow mist that had feelings. Don Juan told me that he was going to mold me for flying. The sensation I had then was that the words were like pliers that twisted and molded my feelings. Don Genaro's words were an invitation to follow him. I felt I wanted to, but I couldn't. The split was so great that I was incapacitated. Then I heard the same short statements repeated endlessly by both of them. Things like, "Look at that magnificent flying shape. Leap, leap. Your legs will reach the treetops. The eucalyptuses are like green dots. The worms are lights." Something in me must have ceased at a given moment. Perhaps my awareness of being talked to. I sensed that Don Genaro was still with me, yet from the point of view of my perception, I could only distinguish an enormous mass of the most extraordinary lights. At times, their glare diminished, and at times the lights became intense. I was also experiencing movement. The effect was like being pulled by a vacuum that never let me stop. Whenever my motion seemed to diminish, and I could actually focus my awareness on the lights, the vacuum would pull me away again. At one moment, between being pulled back and forth, I experienced the ultimate confusion. The world around me, whatever it was coming and going at the same time, thus the vacuum-like effect. I could see 2 separate worlds, one that was going away from me, and the other that was coming closer to me. I didn't realize this as one ordinarily would. That is, I didn't become aware of it as something that had thus far been unrevealed. I rather had 2 realizations without the unifying conclusion. After that, my perceptions became dull. They either lacked precision or they were too many, and I had no way of sorting them. The next batch of discernible apperceptions were a series of sounds that happened at the end of a long tube-like formation. The tube was myself, and the sounds were Don Juan and Don Genaro, again talking to me through each of my ears. The more they talked, the shorter the tube became, until the sounds were in a range I recognized. That is to say, the sounds of Don Juan and Don Genaro's words reached my normal range of perception. The sounds were first recognizable as noises, then as words yelled, and finally as words whispered in my ears. I next noticed things of the familiar world. I was apparently lying face down. I could distinguish clumps of dirt, small rocks, dried leaves, and then I became aware of the field of eucalyptus trees. Don Juan and Don Genaro were standing by me. It was still light. I felt that I had to get into the water in order to consolidate myself. I walked to the river, took off my clothes, and stayed in the cold water long enough to restore my perceptual balance. Don Genaro left as soon as we arrived at his house. He casually patted me on the shoulder as he was leaving. I jumped away in a reflex reaction. I thought that his touch was going to be painful. To my amazement, it was simply a gentle pat on the shoulder. Don Juan and Don Genaro laughed like two kids celebrating a prank. "Don't be so jumpy," Don Genaro said. "The Nahual is not after you all the time." He smacked his lips as though disapproving my overreaction, and with an air of candor and comradeship, he extended his arms. I embraced him. He patted my back in a most friendly, warm gesture. "You must be concerned with the Nahual only at certain moments," he said. "The rest of the time, you and I are like all the other people on this earth." He faced Don Juan and smiled at him. "Isn't it so, Juancho?" he asked, emphasizing the word Juancho, a funny nickname for Juan. "That's so, Gerancho," Don Juan answered, making up the word Gerancho. They both had an explosion of laughter. "I must warn you," Don Juan said to me. "You have to exert the most demanding vigil to be sure when a man is a Nahual and when a man is simply a man. You may die if you come into direct physical contact with the Nahual." Don Juan turned to Don Genaro and with a beaming smile asked, "Isn't it so, Gerancho?" "That's so, absolutely so, Juancho," Don Genaro replied, and both of them laughed. Their childlike mirth was very moving to me. The events of the day had been exhausting, and I was very emotional. A wave of self-pity engulfed me. I was about to weep as I kept on repeating to myself that whatever they had done to me was irreversible and most likely injurious. Don Juan seemed to be reading my thoughts and shook his head in a gesture of disbelief. He chuckled. I made an effort to stop my internal dialogue, and my self-pity vanished. "Genaro is very warm," Don Juan commented when Don Genaro had left. "The design of power was that you found a gentle benefactor." I didn't know what to say. The idea that Don Genaro was my benefactor intrigued me no end. I wanted Don Juan to tell me more about it. He didn't seem inclined to talk. He looked at the sky and at the top of the dark silhouette of some trees at the side of the house. He sat down with his back against a thick forked pole planted almost in front of the door and told me to sit next to him to his left. I sat by him. He pulled me closer by the arm until I was touching him. He said that that time of the night was dangerous for me, especially on that occasion. In a very calm voice, he gave me a set of instructions. We were not to move from the spot until he saw fit to do so. We were to keep on talking on an even keel without long interruptions, and I had to breathe and blink as if I were facing the Nahual. "Is the Nahual around here?" I asked. "Of course," he said, and chuckled. I practically huddled against Don Juan. He began to talk and actually solicited any kind of question from me. He even handed me my notebook and pencil as if I could write in the darkness. His contention was that I needed to be as calm and normal as possible, and there could be no better way of fortifying my tonal than through taking notes. He put the whole matter on a very compelling level. He said that if taking notes was my predilection, then I should be able to do it in complete darkness. There was a tone of challenge in his voice when he said that I could turn the taking of notes into a warrior's task, in which case the darkness would be no obstacle. Somehow, he must have convinced me, for I managed to scribble down parts of our conversation. The main topic was Don Genaro as my benefactor. I was curious to know when Don Genaro had become my benefactor, and Don Juan coaxed me to remember a supposedly extraordinary event that had happened the day I had met Don Genaro, and which served as a proper omen. I could not recollect anything of the sort. I began to recount the experience as far as I could remember. It was a most unobtrusive and casual meeting which took place in the spring of 1968. Don Juan stopped me. "If you're dumb enough not to remember," he said, "we'd better leave it that way. A warrior follows the dictums of power. You will remember it when it becomes necessary." Don Juan said that having a benefactor was a most difficult matter. He used as an example the case of his own apprentice, Eligio, who had been with him for many years. He said that Eligio had been unable to find a benefactor. I asked him if Eligio would eventually find one. He answered that there was no way of predicting the quirks of power. He reminded me that once, years before, we had found a group of young Indians roaming around the desert in northern Mexico. He said that he saw that none of them had a benefactor, and that the general surroundings and the mood of the moment were just right for him to give them a hand by showing them the Nahual. He was talking about one night when 4 young men sat by a fire while Don Juan put on what I thought to be a spectacular show in which he apparently appeared to each of us in a different guise. "Those guys knew a great deal," he said. "You were the only greenhorn among them." "What happened to them afterwards?" I asked. "Some of them found a benefactor," he replied. Don Juan said that it was the duty of a benefactor to deliver his ward to power, and that the benefactor imparted to the neophyte his personal touch, as much, if not more so, than the teacher. During a short pause in our talk, I heard a strange rasping noise at the back of the house. Don Juan held me down. I had almost stood up as a reaction to it. Before the noise happened, our conversation had been a matter of course for me, but when the pause occurred and there was a moment of silence, the strange noise popped through it. At that instant, I had the certainty that our conversation was an extraordinary event. I had the sensation that the sound of Don Juan's words and mine were like a sheet that broke, and that the rasping sound had been deliberately prowling, waiting for a chance to break through. Don Juan commanded me to sit tight and not to pay attention to the surroundings. The rasping noise reminded me of the sound of a gopher clawing on hard, dry ground. The moment I had thought of the simile, I also had a visual image of a rodent like the one Don Juan had showed me on his palm. It was as if I were falling asleep and my thoughts were turning into visions or dreams. I began the breathing exercise and held my stomach with my clasped hands. Don Juan kept on talking, but I wasn't listening to him. My attention was on the soft rustle of a snake-like thing slithering over small, dry leaves. I had a moment of panic and physical revulsion at the thought of a snake crawling on me. I involuntarily put my feet under Don Juan's legs and breathed and blinked frantically. I heard the noise, so close that it seemed to be only a couple of feet away. My panic mounted. Don Juan calmly said that the only way to fend off the Nahual was to remain unaltered. He ordered me to stretch my legs and not to focus my attention on the noise. He imperatively demanded that I write or ask questions and make an effort not to succumb. After a great struggle, I asked him if Don Genaro was making the noise. He said that it was the Nahual, and that I should not mix them. Genaro was the name of the tonal. He then said something else, but I couldn't understand him. Something was circling around the house, and I couldn't concentrate on our conversation. He commanded me to make a supreme effort. At one moment, I found that I was babbling idiocies about my being unworthy. I had a jolt of fear and snapped into a state of great lucidity. Don Juan told me then that it was all right to listen. But there were no sounds. "The Nahual is gone," Don Juan said, and stood up and went inside. He lit Don Genaro's kerosene lantern and made some food. We ate in silence. I asked him if the Nahual was coming back. "No," he said with a serious expression. "It was just testing you. At this time of night, just after the twilight, you should always involve yourself in something. Anything would do. It is only for a short period, an hour perhaps, but in your case, a most deadly hour. Tonight the Nahual tried to make you stumble, but you were strong enough to ward off its assault. Once you succumbed to it, and I had to pour water over your body. This time, you did fine." I remarked that the word assault made the event sound very dangerous. "Made it sound dangerous? That's a weird way of putting it," he said. "I'm not trying to scare you. The actions of the Nahual are deadly. I've already told you that. And it is not that Genaro tries to hurt you. On the contrary, his concern for you is impeccable. But if you don't have enough power to parry the Nahual's onslaught, you're dead, regardless of my help or Genaro's concern." After we finished eating, Don Juan sat next to me and looked over my shoulder at my notes. I commented that it would probably take me years to assort everything that had happened to me during that day. I knew that I had been flooded with perceptions I could not ever hope to understand. "If you cannot understand, you're in great shape," he said. "It is when you understand that you're in a mess. That's from the point of view of a sorcerer, of course. From the point of view of an average man, if you fail to understand, you're sinking. In your case, I would say that an average man would think that you are disassociated, or you're beginning to become disassociated." I laughed at his choice of words. I knew that he was throwing the concept of disassociation back at me. I had mentioned it to him some time back in connection with my fears. I assured him that this time I was not going to ask anything about what I had been through. "I've never put a ban on talking," he said. "We can talk about the Nahual to your heart's content as long as you don't try to explain it. If you remember correctly, I said that the Nahual is only for witnessing. So we can talk about what we witnessed and about how we witnessed it. You want to take on the explanation of how it is all possible, though, and that is an abomination. You want to explain the Nahual with the Tonal. That is stupid, especially in your case, since you can no longer hide behind your ignorance. You know very well that we make sense in talking only because we stay within certain boundaries, and those boundaries are not applicable to the Nahual." I attempted to clarify the issue. It wasn't only that I wanted to explain everything from a rational point of view, but my need to explain stemmed from my necessity to maintain order throughout the tremendous onslaughts of chaotic stimuli and perceptions I had had. Don Juan's comment was that I was trying to defend a point I didn't agree with. "You know damn well that you're indulging," he said. "To maintain order means to be a perfect tonal, and to be a perfect tonal means to be aware of everything that takes place on the island of the tonal. But you're not. So your argument about maintaining order has no truth in it. You only use it to win an argument." I didn't know what to say. Don Juan sort of consoled me by saying that it took a gigantic struggle to clean the island of the Tonal. Then he asked me to recount all I had perceived in my second session with the Nahual. When I had finished, He said that what I had witnessed as a furry crocodile was the epitome of Don Genado's sense of humor. "It's a pity that you're still so heavy," he said. "You'll always get hooked by bewilderment and miss Genado's real art." "Were you aware of his appearance, Don Juan?" "No, the show was only for you." "What did you see?" "Today all I could see was the movement of the Nahual, gliding through the trees and whirling around us. Anyone who sees can witness that." "What about someone who doesn't see?" "He would witness nothing, just the trees being blown by a wild wind, perhaps." "We interpret any unknown expression of the Nahual as something we know. In this case, the Nahual might be interpreted as a breeze shaking the leaves, or even as some strange light, perhaps a lightning bug of unusual size. If a man who doesn't see is pressed, he would say that he thought he saw something, but couldn't remember what. This is only natural. The man would be talking sense. After all, his eyes would have judged nothing extraordinary. Being the eyes of the Tonal, they have to be limited to the Tonal's world, and in that world there is nothing staggeringly new, nothing which the eyes cannot apprehend and the Tonal cannot explain. I asked him about the uncharted perceptions that resulted from their whispering in my ears. "That was the best part of the whole event," he said. "The rest could be dispensed with, but that was the crown of the day. The rule calls for the benefactor and the teacher to make that final trimming, the most difficult of all acts. Both the teacher and the benefactor must be impeccable warriors to even attempt the feat of splitting a man. You don't know this because it still is beyond your realm, but power had been lenient with you again. Genaro is the most impeccable warrior there is." "Why is the splitting of a man a great feat?" "Because it is dangerous. You may have died like a little bug, or worse yet, we may have never been able to put you back together, and you would have remained on that plateau of feeling." "Why was it necessary to do it to me, Don Juan?" "There is a certain time when the Nahual has to whisper in the ear of the apprentice and split him." "What does that mean, Don Juan?" "In order to be an average Tonal, a man must have unity. His whole being must belong to the island of the Tonal. Without that unity, the man would go berserk. A sorcerer, however, has to break that unity, but without endangering his being. A sorcerer's goal is to last. That is, he doesn't take unnecessary risks. Therefore, he spends years sweeping his island until a moment when he could, in a manner of speaking, sneak off it. Splitting a man in two is the gate for such an escape. The splitting, which is the most dangerous thing you've ever gone through, was smooth and simple. The Nahual was masterful in guiding you. Believe me, only an impeccable warrior can do that. I felt very good for you." Don Juan put his hand on my shoulder, and I had a gigantic urge to weep. "Am I arriving at the point when you won't see me anymore?" I asked. He laughed and shook his head. "You indulge like a son of a bitch," he said. "We all do that, though. We have different ways, that's all. Sometimes I indulge too. My way is to feel that I have pampered you and made you weak. I know that Genaro has the same feeling about Pablito. He pampers him like a child, but that is the way power set it up to be. Genaro gives Pablito everything he's capable of giving, and one cannot wish he would do something else. One cannot criticize a warrior for doing his impeccable best." He was quiet for a moment. I was too nervous to sit in silence. "What do you think was happening to me when I felt like I was being sucked by a vacuum?" I asked. "You were gliding," he said in a matter-of-fact tone. "Through the air?" "No. For the Nahual there is no land, or air, or water. At this point you yourself can agree with that. Twice you were in that limbo, and you were only at the door of the Nahual. You've told me that everything you encountered was uncharted, so the Nahual glides, or flies, or does whatever it may do in Nahual's time, and that has nothing to do with Tonal's time. The two things don't jibe. As Don Juan spoke, I felt a tremor in my body. My jaw dropped, and my mouth opened involuntarily. My ears unplugged, and I could hear a barely perceptible tingle or vibration. While I was describing my sensations to Don Juan, I noticed that when I talked, it sounded as if someone else were talking. It was a complex sensation that amounted to my hearing what I was going to say before I said it. My left ear was a source of extraordinary sensations. I felt that it was more powerful and more accurate than my right ear. There was something in it that had not been there before. When I turned around to face Don Juan, who was to my right, I became aware that I had a range of clear auditory perception around that ear. It was a physical space, a range within which I could hear everything with incredible fidelity. By turning my head around, I could scan the surroundings with my ear. "The whispering of the Nahual did that to you," Don Juan said, when I described my sensorial experience. "It'll come at times and then vanish. Don't be afraid of it, or of any unusual sensation that you may have from now on. But above all, don't indulge and become obsessed with those sensations. I know you will succeed. The time for your splitting was right. Power fixed all that. Now everything depends on you. If you are powerful enough, you will sustain the great shock of being split. But if you are incapable of holding on, you will perish. You will begin to wither away, lose weight, become pale, absent-minded, irritable, quiet." "Perhaps if you would have told me years ago," I said, "what you and Don Genaro were doing, I would have enough—" He raised his hand and didn't let me finish. "That's a meaningless statement," he said. "You once told me that if it wouldn't be for the fact that you're stubborn and given to rational explanations, you would be a sorcerer by now. But to be a sorcerer in your case means that you have to overcome stubbornness and the need for rational explanations, which stand in your way. What's more, those shortcomings are your road to power. You can't say that power would flow to you if your life would be different. Genaro and I have to act the same way you do, within certain limits. Power sets up those limits, and a warrior is, let's say, a prisoner of power. A prisoner who has one free choice. The choice to act either like an impeccable warrior or to act like an ass. In the final analysis, perhaps the warrior is not a prisoner, but a slave of power, because that choice is no longer a choice for him. Genaro cannot act in any other way but impeccably. To act like an ass would drain him and cause his demise. The reason why you're afraid of Genaro is because he has to use the avenue of fright to shrink your tonal. Your body knows that, although your reason may not, and thus your body wants to run away every time Genaro is around. I mentioned that I was curious to know if Don Genaro deliberately set out to scare me. He said that the Nahual did strange things, things which were not foreseeable. He gave me, as an example, what had happened between us in the morning when he prevented my turning to my left to look at Don Genaro in the tree. He said that he was aware of what his Nahual had done, although he had no way of knowing about it ahead of time. His explanation of the whole affair was that my sudden movement to the left was a step towards my death, which my tonal was deliberately taking as a suicidal plunge. That movement stirred his Nahual, and the result was that some part of him fell on top of me. I made an involuntary gesture of perplexity. Your reason is telling you again that you're immortal, he said. What do you mean by that, Don Juan? An immortal being has all the time in the world for doubts and bewilderment and fears. A warrior, on the other hand, cannot cling to the meanings made under the Tonal's order because he knows for a fact that the totality of himself has but a little time on this earth. I wanted to make a serious point. My fears and doubts and bewilderment were not on a conscious level, and no matter how hard I tried to control them, every time I was confronted with Don Juan and Don Genaro, I felt helpless. A warrior cannot be helpless, he said, or bewildered or frightened, not under any circumstances. For a warrior there is time only for his impeccability. Everything else drains his power. Impeccability replenishes it. We're back again to my old question, Don Juan. What's impeccability? Yes, we're back again to your old question, and consequently we're back again to my old answer. Impeccability is to do your best in whatever you're engaged in. But Don Juan, my point is that I'm always under the impression I'm doing my best. And obviously I'm not. It's not as complicated as you make it appear. The key to all these matters of impeccability is the sense of having or not having time. As a rule of thumb, when you feel and act like an immortal being that has all the time in the world, you are not impeccable. At those times, you should turn, look around, and then you will realize that your feeling of having time is an idiocy. There are no survivors on this earth. The Wings of Perception. Don Juan and I spent the whole day in the mountains. We left at dawn. He took me to 4 places of power, and at each one of them he gave me specific instructions on how to proceed towards the fulfillment of the particular task that he had outlined years before as a life situation for me. We returned in the late afternoon. After eating, Don Juan left Don Genaro's house. He told me that I had to wait for Pablito, who was bringing some kerosene for the lantern, and that I should talk to him. I became utterly absorbed in working on my notes and didn't hear Pablito come in until he was next to me. Pablito's comment was that he'd been practicing the Gate of Power, and because of that, I couldn't possibly have heard him unless I was capable of seeing. I had always liked Pablito. I had not, however, had very many opportunities in the past to be alone with him, although we were good friends. Pablito had always struck me as being a most charming person. His name, of course, was Pablo, but the diminutive, Pablito, suited him better. He was small-boned but wiry. Like Don Genaro, he was lean, unsuspectedly muscular, and strong. He was perhaps in his late 20s, but it seemed like he was 18. He was dark and of medium height. His brown eyes were clear and bright, and like Don Genaro, he had a winning smile with a touch of devilishness in it. I asked him about his friend Nestor, Don Genaro's other apprentice. In the past, I'd always seen them together, and they had always given me the impression of having an excellent rapport with each other, yet they were opposites in physical appearance and character. While Pablito was jovial and frank, Nestor was gloomy and withdrawn. He was also taller, heavier, darker, and much older. Pablito said that Nestor had finally become involved in his work with Don Genaro, and that he had changed into an altogether different person since the last time I had seen him. He didn't want to elaborate any further on Nestor's work or change of personality, and abruptly shifted the topic of conversation. "I understand the Nagual is biting your heels," he said. I was surprised that he knew, and I asked how he had found that out. "Genaro tells me everything," he said. I noticed that he didn't speak of Don Genaro in the same formal way I did. He simply called him Genaro, in a familiar fashion. He said that Don Genaro was like his brother, and that they were at ease around each other, as though they were family. He openly professed that he loved Don Genaro dearly. I was deeply moved by his simplicity and candor, and talking to him, I realized how close in temperament Don Juan and I were. Thus, our relationship was formal and strict in comparison to Don Genaro and Pablito's. I asked Pablito why he was afraid of Don Juan. His eyes flickered. It was as if the mere thought of Don Juan made him wince. He didn't answer. He seemed to be assessing me in some mysterious way. "You're not afraid of him?" he asked. I told him I was afraid of Don Genaro, and he laughed as if that were the last thing he expected to hear. He said that the difference between Don Juan and Don Genaro was like the difference between day and night. Don Genaro was the day, Don Juan was the night, and as such, he was the most frightening being on earth. Describing his fear for Don Juan led Pablito to make some comments about his own condition as an apprentice. "I'm in a most miserable state," he said. "If you could see what's in my house, you would realize that I know too much for an ordinary man, and yet if you saw me with a nahual, you would realize that I don't know enough." He quickly changed the subject and began to laugh at my taking notes. He said that Don Genaro had provided hours of fun, imitating me. He added that Don Genaro liked me very much in spite of the oddities of my person, and that he had expressed his delight in my being his protegido. This was the first time I had heard that term. It was congruous with another term introduced by Don Juan at the beginning of our association. He had told me that I was his escogido, the chosen one. The word protegido meant the protected one. I asked Pablito about his meetings with the nahual, and he told me the story of his first encounter with it. He said that once Don Juan gave him a basket, which he took to be a gift of goodwill. He placed it on a hook over the door of his room, and since he couldn't conceive any use for it at that moment, he forgot about it all day. He said that his idea was that the basket was a gift of power and had to be put to use with something very special. During the early evening, which Pablito said was his deadly hour also, he walked into his room to get his jacket. He was alone in the house and was getting ready to go visit a friend. The room was dark. He grabbed the jacket, and when he was about to reach the door, the basket fell in front of him and rolled near his feet. Pablito said that he laughed his fright away as soon as he saw that it had only been the basket that had fallen from the hook. He leaned over to pick it up and got the jolt of his life. The basket jumped out of his reach and began to shake and squeak as if someone were twisting and pressing down on it. Pablito said that there was enough light coming from the kitchen to clearly distinguish everything in the room. He stared at the basket for a moment, although he felt he should not do that. The basket began to convulse in the midst of some heavy, rasping, and difficult breathing. Pablito maintained, in recounting his experience, that he actually saw and heard the basket breathing, and that it was alive and chased him around the room, blocking his exit. He said that the basket then began to swell. All the strips of bamboo came loose and turned into a giant ball, like a dry tumbleweed that rolled towards him. He fell backwards on the floor, and the ball began to crawl onto his feet. Pablito said that by that time he was out of his mind, screaming hysterically. The ball had him trapped and moved on his legs like pins going through him. He tried to push it away and then noticed that the ball was the face of Don Juan, with his mouth open, ready to devour him. At that point, he couldn't stand the terror and lost consciousness. Pablito, in a very frank and open manner, told me a series of terrifying encounters that he and other members of his household had had with the nahual. We spent hours talking. He seemed to be in very much the same quandary that I was in, but was definitely more sensitive than I in handling himself within the sorcerer's frame of reference. At one moment, he got up and said that he felt Don Juan was coming and didn't want to be found there. He took off with incredible speed. It was as if something had pulled him out of the room. He left me in the middle of saying goodbye. Don Juan and Don Genaro came back shortly. They were laughing. "Pablito was running down the road like a soul chased by the devil," Don Juan said. "I wonder why." "I think he got frightened when he saw Carlitos working his fingers to the bone," Don Genaro said, mocking my writing. He came closer to me. "Hey, I've got an idea," he said, almost in a whisper. "Since you like to write so much, why don't you learn to write with your finger instead of a pencil? That'll be a blast." Don Juan and Don Genaro sat by my side and laughed while they speculated about the possibility of writing with one's finger. Don Juan, in a serious tone, made a strange comment. He said, "There is no doubt that he could write with his finger. But would he be able to read it?" Don Genaro doubled up with laughter and added, "I am confident that he can read anything." And then he began to tell a most disconcerting tale about a country bumpkin who became an important official during a time of political upheaval. Don Genaro said that the hero of his story was appointed minister or governor or perhaps even president because there was no way of telling what people would do in their folly. Because of this appointment, he came to believe that he was indeed important and learned to put on an act. Don Genaro paused and examined me with the air of a ham actor overplaying his part. He winked at me and moved his eyebrows up and down. He said that the hero of the story was very good at public appearances and could whip up a speech with no difficulty at all, but that his position required that he read his speeches, and the man was illiterate. So he used his wits to outsmart everybody. He had a sheet of paper with something written on it and flashed it around whenever he gave a speech, and thus his efficiency and other good qualities were undeniable to all the country bumpkins. But one day, a literate stranger came along and noticed that the hero was reading his speech while holding the sheet upside down. He began to laugh and pointed out the lie to everyone. Don Genaro again paused for a moment and looked at me, squinting his eyes, and asked, "Do you think that the hero was caught?" "Not a chance." He faced everyone calmly and said, "Upside down? Why should the position of the sheet matter if you know how to read?" And the bumpkins agreed with him. Don Juan and Don Genaro both exploded into laughter. Don Genaro patted me gently on the back. It was as if I were the hero of the story. I felt embarrassed and laughed nervously. I thought that perhaps there was a hidden meaning to it, but I didn't dare ask. Don Juan moved closer to me. He leaned over and whispered in my right ear, "Don't you think it's funny?" Don Genaro also leaned over towards me and whispered in my left ear, "What did he say?" I had an automatic reaction to both questions and made an involuntary synthesis. "Yes, I thought he asked it's funny," I said. They were obviously aware of the effect of their maneuvers. They laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks. Don Genaro, as usual, was more exaggerated than Don Juan. He fell backwards and rolled on his back a few yards away from me. He lay on his stomach, extending his arms and legs out, and whirled around on the ground as though he were lying on a swivel. He whirled until he got close to me and his foot touched mine. He sat up abruptly and smiled sheepishly. Don Juan was holding his sides. He was laughing very hard, and it seemed that his stomach hurt. After a while, they both leaned over and kept on whispering into my ears. I tried to memorize the sequence of their utterances, but after a futile effort, I gave up. There were too many. They whispered in my ears until I again had the sensation that I had been split in two. I became a mist, like the day before, a yellow glow that sensed everything directly. That is, I could know things. There were no thoughts involved. There were only certainties. And when I came into contact with a soft, spongy, bouncy feeling which was outside of me and yet was part of me, I knew it was a tree. I sensed it was a tree by its odor. It didn't smell like any specific tree I could remember. Nonetheless, something in me knew that peculiar odor was the essence of tree. I didn't have just the feeling that I knew, nor did I reason my knowledge out or shuffle clues around. I simply knew that there was something there in contact with me, all around me. A friendly, warm, compelling smell emanating from something which was neither solid nor liquid, but an undefined something else which I knew was a tree. I felt that by knowing it in that manner, I was tapping its essence. I wasn't repelled by it. It rather invited me to melt with it. It engulfed me, or I engulfed it. There was a bond between us which was neither exquisite nor displeasing. The next sensation I could recollect with clarity was a wave of wonder and exultation. All of me vibrated. It was as if charges of electricity were going through me. They weren't painful. They were pleasing, but in such an undetermined form that there was no way of categorizing them. I knew, nevertheless, that whatever I was in contact with was the ground. Some part of me acknowledged with concise certainty that it was the ground, but the instant I tried to discern the infinitude of direct perceptions I was having, I lost all capacity to differentiate my perceptions. Then, all of a sudden, I was myself again. I was thinking. It was such an abrupt transition that I thought I had woken up, yet there was something in the way I felt that was not quite myself. I knew that there was indeed something missing before I fully opened my eyes. I looked around. I was still in a dream or having a vision of some sort. My thought processes, however, were not only unimpaired, but extraordinarily clear. I made a quick assessment. I had no doubt that Don Juan and Don Genaro had induced my dreamlike state for a specific purpose. I seemed to be on the verge of understanding what that purpose was when something extraneous to me forced me to pay attention to my surroundings. It took me a long moment to orient myself. I was actually lying on my stomach, and what I was lying on was a most spectacular floor. As I examined it, I couldn't avoid a feeling of awe and wonder. I couldn't conceive what it was made of. Irregular slabs of some unknown substance had been placed in a most intricate yet simple fashion. They had been put together, but they were not stuck to the ground or to each other. They were elastic and gave when I attempted to pry them apart with my fingers, but once I released the tension, they went right back to their original position. I tried to get up and was seized by the most outlandish sensory distortion. I had no control over my body. In fact, my body did not seem to be my own. It was inert. I had no connection to any of its parts, and when I tried to stand up, I couldn't move my arms, and I wobbled helplessly on my stomach, rolling on my side. The momentum of my wobbling almost made me do a complete turn onto my stomach again. My outstretched arms and legs prevented me from turning over, and I came to rest on my back. In that position, I caught a glimpse of two strangely shaped legs and the most distorted feet I had ever seen. It was my body. I seemed to be wrapped up in a tunic. The thought that came to my mind was that I was experiencing a scene of myself as a cripple or an invalid of some sort. I tried to curve my back and look at my legs, but I could only jerk my body. I was looking directly at a yellow sky, a deep, rich, lemon yellow sky. It had grooves or canals of a deeper yellow tone, and an endless number of protuberances that hung like drops of water. The total effect of that incredible sky was staggering. I couldn't determine if the protuberances were clouds. There were also areas of shadows and areas of different tones of yellow, which I discovered as I moved my head from side to side. Then something else attracted my attention. A sun at the very zenith of the yellow sky, right over my head, a mild sun, judging by the fact that I could stare into it, that cast a soothing, uniform, whitish light. Before I had had time to ponder upon all these unearthly sights, I was violently shaken. My head jerked and bobbed back and forth. I felt I was being lifted. I heard a shrill voice and giggling, and I was confronted by a most astounding sight. A giant, barefoot female. Her face was round and enormous. Her black hair was cut in pageboy fashion. Her arms and legs were gigantic. She picked me up and lifted me to her shoulders as if I were a doll. My body hung limp. I was looking down her strong back. She had a fine fuzz around her shoulders and down her spine. Looking down from her shoulder, I saw the magnificent floor again. I could hear it giving elastically under her enormous weight, and I could see the pressure marks that her feet left on it. She put me down on my stomach in front of a structure, some sort of building. I noticed then that there was something wrong with my depth perception. I couldn't figure out the size of the building by looking at it. At moments it seemed ridiculously small, but then after I seemingly adjusted my perception, I truly marveled at its monumental proportions. The giant girl sat next to me and made the floor squeak. I was touching her enormous knee. She smelled like candy or strawberries. She talked to me, and I understood everything she said. Pointing to the structure, she told me that I was going to live there. My prowess of observation seemed to increase as I got over the initial shock of finding myself there. I noticed then that the building had 4 exquisite, dysfunctional columns. They didn't support anything. They were on top of the building. Their shape was simplicity itself. They were long and graceful projections that seemed to be reaching for that awesome, incredibly yellow sky. The effect of those inverted columns was sheer beauty to me. I had a seizure of aesthetic rapture. The columns seemed to have been made in one piece. I couldn't even conceive how. The 2 columns in front were joined by a slender beam, a monumentally long rod that I thought may have served as a railing of some sort or a veranda overlooking the front. The giant girl made me slide on my back into the structure. The roof was black and flat and was covered with symmetric holes that let the yellowish glare of the sky show through, creating the most intricate patterns. I was truly awed with the utter simplicity and beauty that had been achieved by those dots of yellow sky showing through those precise holes in the roof and the patterns of shadows that they created on that magnificent and intricate floor. The structure was square, and outside of its poignant beauty,